It's Friday, which means it's another entry in the long-running Rising Friday series. I'm Amber Duke, joined by my co-host, Jessica Burbank. And Jessica, I have just learned that Punxsutawney Phil has not seen his shadow, which means we're supposed to get an early spring. That's good news.
This is very good news for me. I am not a winter person. Also, I was informed by Amber just before we went on that it's the 10-year anniversary of something very special.
That's right. Staten Island Chuck is a groundhog that was held by Mayor Bill de Blasio. He dropped him on camera, and 7 days later, poor Staten Island Chuck died of internal injuries. Very sad. Hopefully, we have some happier news ahead of us. Jessica, why don't you tell us what's up first?
Yes, very sad. He dropped the groundhog, and now we have eternal spring or summer. I'm not sure if this is when global warming started, but I'm happy to blame Bill de Blasio for just about anything. And Joe Biden's not doing so well in the polls. That's what we're going to talk about now. There's damning polls for Joe Biden that are continuing to circulate in the media. We'll be circulating a few for you just now, and these polls are sending the White House into a panic. A new national poll from CNN SSRS shows Trump up 4 points over Biden and Haley up 13 points over the president. Worse still for Biden, nearly 2/3 of voters say that Biden does not deserve to be reelected. Just 36% think that he should get to go back to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Swing states don't look much better for the president. In the critical swing state of Georgia, Trump leads Biden by 8 points, a lead that doesn't disappear even as other candidates are added into the race. Notably, independent candidate RFK Jr. sits at 8%, while Cornel West and Jill Stein are at 3% and 1%, respectively. Speaking of RFK, he took to X recently to slam the president over his seeming failure to address issues facing Black Americans. RFK posted, quote, "Joe Biden is campaigning in South Carolina right now. Let's reminisce on everything he's done for Black Americans. Authored the 1994 crime bill, which led to the mass incarceration of Black people. Said if you don't vote for him, then you ain't Black. Extended penalties for people under 21 charged with selling marijuana. Endorsed segregationist senators. Opposed busing because he didn't want his kids to grow up in a, quote, racial jungle."
RFK wasn't the only one who noted there might be some issues with Biden's tenuous coalition with minorities. MSNBC did a segment on how the left is abandoning Biden in droves. Take a look.
I want to talk about those disappointed progressives and switch gears a moment. Jonathan Chait points out that the coalition that defeated Donald Trump in 2020 seems to have crumbled. He says the left wing of the party is so upset with Joe Biden that some of them are actually ambivalent about a Trump win. Juanita, what is the rationale here? Joe Biden didn't do enough for me, so I'm okay with Trump, who wants none of what I do?
I think the rationale is that they are genuinely fatigued by the strain that people have been under for years now. And I think that came across, let's be real, when Elmo tweets out, "Temp check, how's everybody doing?" And everybody's like, bad.
And how does Biden respond to Trump? By swearing at him in private. A new report from Politico reveals the shocking news that Biden doesn't like the former president very much, which is simply stunning. So, Amber, what do you make of a lot of these polls coming out? Donald Trump versus Joe Biden in a potential 2024 matchup?
It's interesting. It's a little bit different than what we saw immediately after the Iowa caucus. As Trump won by 30 points there, all of a sudden there were some swing state polls that came out suggesting that Trump was actually performing quite poorly. And there was this conspiracy floating around from people in the DeSantis and Haley camps saying that basically the polls had been doctored or amended prior to the Iowa caucus to take away their arguments about electability. And then as soon as it was safe that Trump was going to get the nomination, the polls were going to be accurate and show Trump losing. But now we see in this latest poll that, in fact, his lead in swing states against Biden remains, that it was what we thought it was a few months ago. Of course, Nikki Haley still has, I guess, her point about electability, and that she performs even better against Joe Biden in the national polls than Donald Trump. But then the question becomes, okay, is electability, though, more important than electing someone who shares your values, your ideology? And clearly, members of the Republican Party are saying no.
Yeah, that CNN poll has Trump up by 4 over Biden. it's got a margin of error of 3.8%. Moreover, they polled non-registered voters. It was just a sample of people nationally over the age of 18. And so we know that those polls tend to not be super representative because we don't have high voter participation in the country, at most about 60%. And so we tend to trust the polls of registered voters, which tell a bit of a different story. So the Quinnipiac poll, as compared to the CNN poll, paints a more positive picture for Biden. It was taken nationally, but among registered voters in the same time span of January 25th through the 30th. It's got a smaller margin of error of just 2.4%, and it's got Biden up 50 to 44. So, as much as I would love these polls showing Trump winning, to send the Biden administration into this mode of we've got to get some stuff done before we come to the polls, before Election Day rolls around, I would love that. I don't think that's the situation we're in. I think the polls show that it's still an extremely close race. But it's interesting to see Nikki Haley up 13%. She performs well among, the voting class of people. I think people are worried not only about the Middle East, which 8 in 10 voters in this Quinnipiac poll said, they were very concerned about the administration's handling of, but also Joe Biden's age. I think Nikki Haley's a little bit younger, and that's why in some of these national polls, she's performing very well. But I just don't see her popularity withstanding the next few months into November.
I agree. I think she's been relatively untested prior to this national race, and she's gotten some attacks from the DeSantis campaign, some from Trump. But if we get what we all wish for, at least I'm wishing for this, a Trump-Haley debate, she's going to be laid bare for all of the world to see. Her campaign keeps begging Trump to debate her in South Carolina. I think that's a terrible idea. There's no reason why Trump should do it in the first place, but just for entertainment value alone, I wish that he would. But I think you're right. The polls across the board definitely show a pretty tight race, effectively tied from a national level. The swing states give a slight edge to former President Donald Trump. And then this question on foreign policy is really important because foreign policy and national security are typically not huge issues in presidential elections. But now we see it creeping into 4th, 5th place for voters because of all of the craziness that's been going on abroad, whether it's Russia and Ukraine, whether it's the Israel-Palestine conflict, which has Biden's base of Arab Americans and young Americans fleeing from supporting him because of his handling of that and his support of Israel and his continuance of providing weapons and aid to Israel. And then we have this conflict with Iran, where the Iranian-backed Houthis are attacking U.S. ships in the Red Sea. Now we have a drone strike in Jordan by a different Iranian-backed militia that killed 3 American service members. Biden is still apparently determining what exactly the response is going to be. He claims he's decided, but it took him 3 or 4 days. We still don't know exactly what it's going to be. I think there were reports saying that he was going to launch some kind of strike. But there's a huge possibility, of course, that this could escalate tensions in the region, could escalate us into a war with Iran. So when you're looking as a voter at all of these situations, and especially given the fact that Biden's poll numbers first started to plummet after the Afghanistan withdrawal because of how horribly that was handled, when you're looking at the difference between a Joe Biden and a Nikki Haley on foreign policy, they're effectively the same. So I would think that for voters who are really concerned about foreign policy, as the race goes on, as these candidates start to lay out their foreign policy ideology a little bit more strongly, then you're going to start to see maybe some of that support for Haley decline as they realize that she is very, very similar to Biden on these issues.
Right. And when third-party candidates are introduced into these polls, we see Trump and Biden at 37%, 39%. So things are going to look very different come to 2024 when we're not doing these polls of just a matchup of Biden versus Trump. And statements like the one that RFK Jr. made about Biden on race, I think are really going to affect ultimately who people vote for and if they opt for a third-party candidate. That MSNBC interview really focused on, are you really going to, as a minority, vote for Joe Biden over Donald Trump, who said things that are bad about minorities? And there's such a focus on sentiments, on what they're saying, and not what the actual material consequences are of their presidency. Biden was saying, essentially, the administration was saying that Iran was guilty in the situation with the Houthis for supplying them with weapons. And by that standard, if you're an ally of Palestine, theoretically, you could be very disappointed and hold the United States accountable for supplying weapons to Israel by the same moral structure. And so I think the administration's got to be very careful about how involved they get with Iran over this conflict, because that same argument that the U.S. is making could be used directly against us for us supplying weapons to Israel. And so really the material consequences of a Biden presidency, if you're of Palestinian descent, or if you see the Palestinian struggle as a struggle that's shared among minorities or just people fighting for liberation, you're going to be extremely critical of the Biden administration. You're probably not going to vote for them. It doesn't really matter if Donald Trump is out there saying things that you deem are racist, if Joe Biden's policies are hurting minority populations at home and abroad. And so I really think that's where decisions are coming from. And it's funny to me to see MSNBC just make this all about what's been said and not what the policy consequences are. I just hate when political conversations seem to forget that it's the president's job to govern.
It's sort of the classic axiom that comes from Trump supporters and surrogates for the Trump campaign, which is, hey, you guys didn't like mean tweets, and look at what you got. We're going to be back with more Rising after this.